reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Listen for the word of the Lord. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him, and calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." Then they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star they had seen at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray together once more. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, Lord. You are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So it was at the beginning of December, and it was Wednesday, and I was waiting for Brown Bag Bible Study to begin, and I was sitting in the room when a member of this congregation came in and said, "I'm so excited to see the wise men out by the road." And I thought, what? Because I had walked in, I saw the nativity. It was empty, but I didn't think anything of it. Maybe we were still in the process of setting up. The conversation in Brown Bag continued. Someone commented, "We might need some new wise men. They're looking a little shabby." Somebody else said, "Well, they've had a long journey, so they're okay how they are." I was still scratching my head, so I turned to my neighbor. I said, "Why are there wise men out by the road?" She said, "We have to be liturgically accurate." You see, the wise men, they start by the road, and each week they will move closer, but they won't get to Jesus until Epiphany. We have to be liturgically accurate. Well, friends, it is Epiphany. We are here. The wise men have made it to Jesus. Epiphany Sunday, Epiphany meaning manifestation or revealing, the revelation of God in the child, Jesus Christ, to the seekers who have traveled from the east. And based on the liturgically accurate nativity scene, I think you might be familiar with the story. It's so familiar that a couple weeks later, towards the end of December, I was up in the church offices and probably talking too loudly as I do, and I was telling Alex, "I am so excited to preach on Epiphany, the story of the wise men. It really packs a theological punch." Morrisville Presbyterian Church, one of your very wise and well-educated staff yelled from their office, "Magi." They came to the door and they said, "Magi," or in the Greek, magoi, but definitely don't translate it as wise men. I stood corrected. It reminds me of a story that Fred Craddock, the great preacher, he writes about. He writes about a time he was 18, he hadn't been to seminary, he had no theological education. He was asked to preach on Epiphany in a small rural church in Gleason, Tennessee. He writes that he couldn't tell you what he had to say that morning, but he knows that he mentioned the three magi because in the middle of his sermon, an elder stood up in the back of the church and said, "Son, what makes you think there were three?" and walked out. So it's a familiar story. It's so familiar, sometimes we confuse the details a little bit, but that's okay because the story has a lot of room for imagination. It's a story that invites us to ask a lot of questions. And here's what I mean by this. The text starts, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. And I don't know about you, but I already have a lot of questions. In the time of King Herod, which Herod are we talking about? How are we supposed to understand this? Is there something that's supposed to be communicated? In the time of King Herod, Magi from the east, which begs the question, what is a Magi? We've often heard it translated as wise men, although that's not a great translation. Elsewhere in Matthew, it's translated as magician, which would certainly give us a new meaning to the story. The magicians from the east came to Jerusalem. Others speculate that they were astronomers, for they had studied the stars and seen the stars at its rising. If you reference Psalm 72, you might think they were kings. We don't know. And how many were there, and what were their names, and what did they look like? And they came from the east. Where is the east? Is that Babylon or Persia or Arabia or further? I don't know. And the story continues. They were following a star they saw at its rising. They followed it until they got to Jerusalem, and they started asking around, where is the King of the Jews? I want to ask how they knew that, but it's in the story, where is the King of the Jews? And in Jerusalem, they're asking around, and King Herod hears about this, and as do all the people, and the text tells us that they were all frightened. A new king means political and social change. A new king means the status quo, whatever it may have been at the time, it's not going to hold. And so they were afraid. So Herod asked the chief priests and the scribes, the ones who would have known the scriptures. They've dedicated their life to studying it. If anyone knows where the child is, the chief priests and scribes, they know. They study the text. They come to an answer, Bethlehem. Herod calls the Magi into a secret meeting, and he says, Bethlehem, go, find the child, let me know where he is, so that I too can worship him. And the Magi go, and I find myself wondering why the chief priests and scribes, the ones who've spent their life studying the scriptures, why they're not going as well. The King of the Jews has been born, but the text doesn't give us that answer. So the Magi go, the star has reappeared, which raises a lot of questions about where the star went, but it's reappeared, they're following it, it stops, they're overjoyed, it tells us they go into the house. I'm confused because I thought we were headed towards a manger, but they're going into a house, and they see the child with Mary, and I just want to know where Joseph is. So if you're anything like me, I think it's fair to say the text invites us to ask some questions. There's a lot of room for imagination in the narrative. There's a lot of room for wonder. And we read this text of questions on Epiphany, which falls shortly after the beginning of our calendar year. Now, there are historical and liturgical explanations for why that happens, but I have to say, it strikes me that we are no more than 5 days into 2020, and I have a lot of questions about what this year is going to hold. The clock changed. It was December 31st. Now it's January 1st, and we have a lot of new hopes. Some of us will go to college this year. Some of us hope to start jobs or move up in our career or retire or buy the house or grow our family. I think it's fair to say that we have big hopes for peace and justice. We have other hopes for finally losing that last 15 pounds. We're only 5 days into this new year. We have a lot of hope. We also already have a lot of fear. What will our lives be like by next December 31st? What will our nation look like at that time? What will our world look like at that time? There are things to come that we are anticipating, and there are things to come that we cannot possibly anticipate. And we know that, and so we have a lot of questions. It's a little naive to say that with the change of a clock, those hopes and fears and dreams appeared. They were there in 2019. We've carried them with us into 2020. The grief has stretched after us into the new year, as has the hope and the disappointment, and we have a lot of questions. Let me return to the day when I was gently corrected about the use of the words wise men. It was a Wednesday, and so I went about my Wednesday things, probably walked my dog, studied some more. And that night I had dinner with my friend Katie, who's a fellow seminarian. I think she'll be a brilliant scholar one day, and she is a faithful friend. And we were swapping internship stories, and I told her about being corrected, and she knows the Greek, so I thought she'd get a kick out of it. She looked at me and she said, "Molly, are you planning to preach on the Magi?" I said, "Yes, I'm so excited about it. That's the point of this story." She said, "Molly, Epiphany is not about the Magi. It's about Christ." And the Magi, they see the child with Mary. They see the child and they kneel. And they pay him homage. They worship. Then they open their trunks and give gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and after being warned in a dream, they return home a different way. But first, they worshiped. Then they gave their gifts, and then they were called a different way. Thomas Troger is a professor at Yale Divinity. He writes on this text, particularly about the order of events in this text, and he writes this about, he writes about what it would have looked like if the gifts were given first. Listen to what he writes. If the first thing the Magi do is present their gifts, then it might seem as though they are in command of the situation. There they would stand, their precious goods in their outstretched hands. They would appear like rulers presenting treasures to each other on a state occasion while meeting in the middle of a ceremonial room, each of them on their feet, facing one another. First, the Magi kneel and they pay homage. They worship. I think my friend Katie is right. Epiphany is about Christ. Epiphany is the revelation of Christ, but in that revelation, the Magi, they offer us some things. The mysterious Magi, whoever they were, from the undefined East, wherever that may be, they show us that the love of God reaches beyond the bounds of what is known. And they come to us in a biblical text that reminds us to use our imagination. And they demonstrate for us where we might begin after we encounter Christ. First, they worshiped. So here we are, this first Sunday of 2020, and by whatever way or whatever means you have found your way to this sanctuary, I think it's fair to say that maybe you feel the Spirit stirring a little bit, saying there's a lot to do this year, just as there was a lot to do last year and the year before that and the years before that. As followers of Christ, we will be called upon to use our gifts. There will be injustices we will be called to stand against, truths we will be called to speak, humanity and creation we are called to love. We're probably already doing those things, but we'll probably be called to do them some more this year. So if you'll allow, I'll end with one final thought. This story of the Magi, the story of Epiphany, the story of the Christ child breaking into the world, in Matthew's gospel, it comes at the beginning. Matthew is giving us a sneak peek of what might be to come. The Magi come to visit Christ, and later on, more will come and Christ will welcome them. Christ will welcome the Samaritan adulterers, the greasy tax collectors, despised Roman soldiers, ostracized lepers, me and you. And later today, we will come to the table, and throughout the year, we will come to this table to encounter Christ again and again and again. Or maybe we encounter Christ in the world, and it draws us to the table. Or maybe we start at the table, and we go out and encounter Christ in the world. But regardless, we come to the table knowing that in the year ahead, we have no idea what's to come. The truth is, we don't have the answers to our questions, but we have encountered the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And so, first we will worship the one who holds all things, which includes our questions, it includes our burdens, it includes the unknown. First we will worship because what is a gift without remembering the giver? What is a call if we don't remember the one who calls us? God in human form, love embodied, the one the Magi came to seek. Perhaps you could say this is the fourth gift of the Magi, that they are still teaching us where we might begin when we encounter the King of Kings. Amen.